Okay, so let's talk about the world of online political arguments. What if some of those fights you see, what if they aren't actually arguments at all? What if there's something else entirely? Maybe even weapons in a really calculated campaign? Well, today we're going to break down the claims from a source that outlines what it calls a political demoralization campaign. Let's dive in and see what that's all about. This quote right here, this is pretty much the core idea of the source material we're looking at. It's making a really provocative claim that some of what we think of as online debate has absolutely nothing to do with a real conversation and everything to do with being a tactic in a much wider information war. So, what exactly is this campaign? Well, the source we're analyzing puts forward this central concept, and it's a big one. A highly coordinated effort that it specifically labels a demoralization campaign. Now, according to the source, this isn't just about, spreading some negativity online. It's described as a very specific kind of psychological operation. The whole goal is to take wins and completely reframe them as losses, to sow all kinds of discord, and ultimately to basically subvert a political movement from the inside out. And what's interesting here is that the source adds a little historical context. It argues that these modern online tactics, well, they aren't new at all. It actually draws a straight line between these alleged strategies and the kind of psychological operations that were used back in the Soviet era. But how would a campaign like this actually work, in the real world? The source breaks down what it calls a core psychological mechanism, a tactic it calls the two Legos. Okay, so this right here is the absolute foundation of the entire strategy, at least according to the source. The argument is that the most powerful ideas, the stickiest ones, aren't the ones someone tells you. They're the ones you figure out for yourself. See, when you believe an idea is your own, your natural defenses against it just drop. So here's how it supposedly works. First, you're given one piece of information. Let's call it Lego A. Then, you're given a totally separate, often completely unrelated piece of information. We'll call that Lego B. Now, here's the key part. The person presenting them never connects the two for you. Instead, they just leave a space, and they let your mind be the one to snap them together. And this is probably what it sounds like in the wild. The source suggests this whole tactic is often disguised as just innocent curiosity. By just asking questions, a person can drop those two Legos into the conversation without ever having to explicitly state the conclusion they want you to come to. And that's the real trick here, according to this theory. Because you are the one who connected piece A to piece B, the conclusion feels like your own personal insight. It feels totally organic. And as the source's main premise states, that makes the idea you just formed incredibly hard to resist or even question. All right, so to move this from theory to practice, the source gives us a case study. It centers on claims from a public figure, Alexis Wilkins, who says she was the target of an organized online network that was using these exact kinds of tactics. So Wilkins' main claim, according to the source, is that an online attack she faced wasn't a real organic outcry from the public. Nope. She alleges it was a coordinated operation, and the source presents the data she provided to try and back that claim up. The analysis presented in the source kicks off with a massive number, 3.1 million. That's the number of retweet engagements this alleged network generated over a 22-month period. This number is presented as the very first sign that we might be looking at something bigger than just a typical online argument. And this chart breaks down what that activity looked like. The source claims that a whopping 80% of it was what it calls pure amplification. In other words, activity from accounts that seem to exist almost exclusively to retweet other people, which would, of course, artificially pump up a message's reach and make it seem way more popular than it is. And then it gets even more specific. In one case that the source details, 659 separate accounts all retweeted the exact same post. Again, the argument here is that this points much more to coordination than just simple coincidence. This brings us to the real core of the data analysis that the source presents. It contrasts the two types of online activity. It argues that a real organic conversation is kind of messy, it's staggered over time. But the activity in question, it was super tightly clustered, with retweets sometimes happening just 1 second apart, a speed that the source claims really suggests automation. These data points, they're basically the Lego A from the theory we just talked about, just pieces of information being laid out for you to connect. The source then goes on to paint a picture of this alleged network with some very specific claims. It suggests links to well-known figures like General Michael Flynn and to certain groups. But maybe most importantly, it argues that this exact same cluster of accounts seems to pop up and reactivate at these key moments of internal division within the Republican Party. So the framing isn't that it's a movement that builds up, but that it's more like a pre-existing tool that just gets deployed whenever it's needed. So let's say these claims are on the money. What's the point of it all? What's the ultimate objective? Well, this final section of the source material gets into the alleged goal of a campaign like this. The end game, as it's described in this material, is actually pretty simple. It's to create chaos. The goal isn't to win an argument or to push for a different policy. It's to fracture a political party from the inside, to absolutely decimate its unity, and to undermine its entire agenda by turning its own supporters against its successes. This final quote from the source material really just wraps the whole argument up in a nutshell. It concludes that the battle being described here, it's not a factual one. It argues that facts almost become irrelevant when the real goal is purely psychological, to demoralize a target audience until they just completely lose faith. And all of that leaves us with a really critical question, especially for the world we live in now. When online movements seem to explode overnight and they're fueled by algorithms and thousands of anonymous accounts, what tools do we even have to tell the difference between a real, genuine groundswell of public opinion and a meticulously coordinated psychological campaign?